Some dude, sometime in the past, said that a story consists of 3 parts: a beginning, a middle, and an end. So we're going to be talking about those 3 parts today. Welcome to How to Write Good. I am your host, Daniel Poppie. You can find out more about me at danielpoppie.com. If it is your first time here, How to Write Good is a writing podcast that seeks to find principles and advice that can be applied across a broad range of writing situations. If you've been here before, don't forget to subscribe, hit that like button below, and share. As I said in the beginning of this podcast, the simplest understanding of the story is pretty old. It's from one of those Greek philosophers, Plato, Aristotle, or Socrates, or Socrates, but I don't remember which one it is, but that philosopher said that a story has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And I actually think viewing stories in this way is really valuable to a writer. I think it helps a writer figure out what they're writing or why they're writing, or it helps them figure out how things flow in their writing better. I actually think this might help writers more, though I'm not positive. I think it might help writers more than the 5-act structure or the 7-point story structure. So that's a big reason I'm talking about it today. So to start by talking about this, I think we need to think about why there's 3 parts. Because if you're breaking things into parts, you're saying there's a distinction between those 3 different parts. There must be a reason, because otherwise, if everything flowed together perfectly, if there weren't distinctions between these 3 parts, then we wouldn't talk about a story being 3 parts. In the same way, if there weren't distinctions, there weren't differences in the 5-act play or the 7-point story structure, we wouldn't break them into those as well. But the most basic understanding of a story is 3 parts, and each of those parts is very distinct, I would say. Some of them look more similar, but they are very different, and I think that they serve a very different function. The 3 parts of a story are very aptly named. They are the beginning, the middle, and the end. The beginning of a story is what I like to refer as the setup of the story, but I don't think you should see the setup as something simple. I think it has a lot of different parts. First of all, it's the very beginning of the story. It's the start of the story. It's introducing the person who's reading it into the world, or whatever world you've created. It presents the world as a stasis. And I think this idea of a stasis is a very important thing in the story. This is the beginning norm. I've talked about this in other podcast episodes before. I'll link them down below so you can check them out if you haven't already. But the beginning stasis is the norm we're working with. And this stasis, I think, is necessary in the beginning of the book because of the next part of that beginning, which is the justification for why the rest of the book needs to take place. In some cases, the stasis itself is presenting the justification for what needs to take place. But in general, I would say that the inciting incident is what we call it, is the reason why the rest of the stasis needs to take place. Now, if you notice that I separate those 2, so I said that the inciting incident might be the reason why the stasis takes place, and I said that the stasis might present us a reason as well. Now, if you're writing or you've been writing for a while, you may think, well, that's the exact same thing, and you're absolutely right. You can put the inciting incident into the stasis, and there can be some flaw in the stasis that exists that needs to be corrected. Or you can have the stasis be something that doesn't have a flaw that's disrupted by the inciting incident. So technically, we're using the inciting incident in both of those cases, but I do like to separate them out because it does show us 2 very distinct ways we can get the story rolling. In most cases where I'm presenting a bad stasis, that is acting as the inciting incident. And in stories that are the hero's journey, the stasis is the paradise the hero starts in. It's not necessarily a paradise, but that's where the hero starts in. It's like Frodo in the Shire before the Lord of the Rings happens, before the story starts. So there are 2 different things going on there. But with this setup, I just want to impress upon you who are listening that this is where we're seeing the old normal, right? You can fit a lot of different things into the old normal. You can fit certain character types. You can fit certain government types. You can fit certain types of descriptions. But when you look at any book, you're going to see an old normal in the book. I think one of the biggest things for writing this old normal is that the reader buys into this and they have enough information to understand how the norm is in the world you're creating, whether that norm looks like ours or not. The last part of the book, and I'm skipping ahead for a very good reason. The last part of the book is the end, of course, and this is where the story ends up. And within this part, you have the button, the final impression that is being left on the reader. You have the results of everything that happened in the story. And these results are what I like to call the new normal, or the new stasis, if you want to put it that way. And there's a very good reason I go to the end of the book first, right? There's a very good reason that I say, hey, well, let's look at the end second instead of third, is because we are moving from the beginning to the end. And I want to contrast this idea of the old stasis, or the old normal, and the new normal. Because you can actually plan out your books, and I have an episode on this. If you want to check it out, I'll link it here. You can plan out your books by knowing what the old normal is in the story and what the new normal is in the story. And then you connect logically between those 2 points. And it can actually be easier when you're plotting out your books because you know where you're moving. You know what's going to happen. If you start at a specific beginning and you don't know where it's going to go at the end, you're going to be making up things as you go along. You might like that. You might like feeling things out as you go. But just as in life, we tend not to start a journey not knowing where we're ending up. And even if we take side roads or we take detours during that journey, we know the direction we're going and we know where we want to go. And it's the same thing with a story. If you know where you're going, you can add things into your story as you write them in a way that you're not able to do if you don't know the direction you're going. So again, this is the new stasis. Something has changed in the story, and this is extremely important. Both sides are extremely important. At the beginning, we had the old stasis. At the end, we have the new stasis. The world could change around the character. In a lot of cases, the character himself changes, and that's extremely important as well. But something has changed in the story. If there is no change in the story, whether outward or inward, then the story probably doesn't have to take place. The final section of the book is the middle. Creative writing classes call this the point with the rising action, or they call it the climax of the story. And yes, I actually do include the climax of the story in the middle part of the story because it shows a distinct ending point for that middle. It shows the breaking of the tension. And then, as I said before, the end of the story shows the result of everything that happened in the story. But this gives it a nice clean cut. It actually fits logically into the middle of the story because before the actual climax, I would have to cut it off as the tension is still building. And if you've ever actually read a story or you've seen a movie, the tension that builds and the climax fit together, right? So if I had a scene ending right before the tension broke, right? If I built up my tension, if I had the rising action, and a few seconds before the climax was about to happen, I cut the scene off, that wouldn't make sense to the person viewing the movie or reading the book. They would think, what's going on here? Why is this happening? What typically happens is the tension builds and builds and builds and builds, and there are points in the story when there are narrative breaks, but the tension and the climax fit together really well. We want to have the tension get to the point just before it breaks, and then we need to see how the tension breaks in that moment. We don't skip ahead in time. We generally don't skip scenes in that moment. We just figure out what happens, and then after that happens, we see the falling action, and then we get to the end in the new stasis. As I said before, in this section, there's the tension is building and building and building. This is the part of the story where the tension is building and building and building. And this is the part of the story where the character is actually moving toward that end state. And there are goals and there's character motivation that come into this part of the story. But the reason for this part of the story is to get the character to that final state, to that final stasis. And there's a lot of different ways to get the character there. but we need to get the character there in a way that makes sense to the reader. So that's what we're always thinking about as we're approaching the middle of the story. Again, this is just a tiny little piece of writing, just remembering these different aspects of a story. If you want to know more about how to write, or you want more writing tips, then you can check out my other videos right here, or if you're listening to this on audio, they'll be in the description below. If you enjoyed this, you're probably wondering how you can support me. Well, you can actually do two simple things. Follow the first link below to grab a copy of my book, and then follow the second link and sign up for my newsletter. It's that simple. Those two things will mean the world to me and give me more time to write books and create content for you. As always, my name is Daniel Poppie, and this is How to Write Good.